At Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, 12-year-old Imani Washington stood trembling amid a crowd of passengers and airline staff whose eyes bore into her with unmistakable contempt. A white woman's voice sliced through the terminal like a blade. "I refuse to sit next to that in first class." Imani's small hands clutched her backpack straps as tears threatened to spill down her brown cheeks. She had no idea that in just 3 hours, her billionaire father would arrive and dismantle the lives of everyone who had humiliated his daughter. Before we dive into this powerful story of injustice and redemption, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe every child deserves respect regardless of their skin color, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next when this father discovers how his precious daughter was treated. Now, let's go back to the beginning and see exactly how this nightmare unfolded. Imani Washington was not an ordinary 12-year-old girl. With deep brown skin that glowed under the afternoon sunlight streaming through the airport windows, neatly braided cornrows that her mother had spent 3 hours perfecting the night before, and large, expressive eyes that held both intelligence and innocence, she carried herself with a quiet confidence instilled by parents who had taught her to stand tall in any room she entered. She wore her favorite navy blue hoodie emblazoned with the MIT logo, a symbol of the dream she nurtured in her heart to become an aerospace engineer one day, paired with comfortable jeans and purple sneakers that had carried her through countless science fairs and robotics competitions. In her arms, she cradled a worn backpack stuffed with books about quantum physics and space exploration, an iPad loaded with educational apps, and a small purple rolling suitcase that contained everything she needed for her visit to Los Angeles to see her father. This Friday afternoon marked the end of a challenging semester at her prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts, and she could barely contain her excitement at the prospect of spending 2 weeks with her dad, telling him about her straight-A report card and her acceptance into an advanced STEM summer program at NASA. The terminal buzzed with the organized chaos, typical of one of the world's busiest airports. Business travelers rushed past with roller bags clicking against polished floors. Families corralled excited children toward their gates, and the steady drone of departure announcements created a soundtrack of constant motion. Imani approached the first-class check-in counter with her boarding pass clutched in one hand and her passport in the other, practicing the polite greeting her mother had coached her to use when interacting with adults. Behind the counter stood Brenda Hutchins, a middle-aged white woman whose severely pulled-back blonde hair and thin-pressed lips gave her an air of perpetual disapproval. Brenda's pale blue eyes swept over Imani with an expression that shifted from neutral professionalism to thinly veiled suspicion in the span of a heartbeat. When Imani slid her boarding pass across the counter with a soft, "Good afternoon, ma'am," Brenda picked it up between 2 fingers as though it might be contaminated, her eyes narrowing as she read the words "First Class" printed clearly on the ticket. "Are you sure this is your ticket, sweetheart?" The question dripped with skepticism, the endearment twisted into something that felt more like an insult. Brenda's fingers tapped against her keyboard with unnecessary force as she pulled up the reservation on her computer screen, her jaw working as though she was chewing on her doubts about this young black girl daring to present a first-class ticket. Imani felt the first flutter of nervousness in her stomach but responded as her parents had taught her, maintaining eye contact and speaking clearly. "Yes, ma'am. My father purchased it for me. I'm flying to Los Angeles to visit him for winter break." Her voice remained steady, despite the growing awareness that something was not quite right about this interaction. Other passengers had been processed quickly, their tickets scanned with efficient smiles and wishes for pleasant flights. Yet here she stood, subjected to an interrogation that seemed to have nothing to do with standard procedure and everything to do with the color of her skin. Brenda's questions continued like water dripping on stone, each one wearing away a little more of Imani's confidence. "Where is your parent or guardian? Does your mother know you're traveling alone?" How did your father afford this ticket? The implications hung heavy in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Behind Imani, a line of passengers began to form, some checking their watches with impatience, others craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. A few whispered to their companions, their eyes flicking between the white airline employee and the young black girl who was clearly being treated differently than the white passengers who had preceded her. Imani explained patiently that she had all the proper documentation for an unaccompanied minor, that her father was a successful businessman, that her mother had signed all the necessary forms, but each answer only seemed to deepen Brenda's suspicion rather than alleviate it. The agent picked up her phone, ostensibly to verify the credit card used for the purchase, keeping Imani standing at the counter for what stretched into an agonizing 15 minutes while curious and judgmental eyes burned into her back. Some passengers whispered loud enough for Imani to hear fragments of their commentary. Probably used a stolen card. Why would a kid be in first class? Something doesn't add up here. Each comment was a small cut. Death by 1,000 assumptions, each one rooted in the ancient and persistent belief that black children in spaces of luxury must somehow be there through deception rather than legitimate means. Imani's hands began to shake slightly as she stood there, her excitement about seeing her father slowly curdling into shame and confusion. She wanted to call her dad right then, to hear his deep voice telling her everything would be okay, that these people were wrong about her, that she belonged wherever she had the right to be. But her phone was tucked in her backpack, and she did not want to appear difficult or cause more problems. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Baby, when you're in these situations, you have to be twice as polite and 10 times as patient as anyone else. It's not fair, but it's reality. At 12 years old, Imani was learning a harsh lesson about how the world saw her, not as a brilliant child with dreams reaching toward the stars, but as a suspect whose very presence in a first-class line required extraordinary proof of legitimacy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was actually 23 minutes by the terminal clock, Brenda reluctantly printed out a boarding pass and slid it across the counter with a warning that felt more like a threat. You better behave yourself up there. First class isn't a playground. The words landed like a slap, the implication that Imani would somehow misbehave simply because of her age, or perhaps because of her race, adding insult to the injury of the prolonged interrogation. Imani took her boarding pass with trembling fingers, managed a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," and walked towards security, with her head held high despite the tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She did not know that Brenda Hutchins had just made the first in a series of catastrophic mistakes that would cost multiple people their careers, their reputations, and their comfortable assumptions about who belonged in spaces of privilege. As Imani placed her backpack on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector, she tried to shake off the encounter, telling herself that once she was on the plane, everything would be better. She had no way of knowing that the worst was yet to come. The jetway stretched before Imani like a tunnel leading to sanctuary. She had flown first class twice before with her father, and the memory of those comfortable leather seats, attentive service, and the feeling of being treated with respect had sustained her through the humiliating check-in process. Now, as she stepped into the aircraft cabin and saw the spacious first-class section with its wide seats upholstered in butter-soft cream leather, individual entertainment screens mounted on privacy dividers, and the warm lighting that gave everything a golden glow, she felt some of her anxiety begin to ease. Her assigned seat, 2A, by the window, offered a perfect view for watching the clouds during takeoff. She stowed her backpack in the overhead compartment, settled into her seat with her iPad, and allowed herself a small smile. In 6 hours, she would be in her father's arms, and this strange day would fade into an unpleasant memory. The flight attendant who greeted her was Gerald Pemberton, a man in his early 50s, whose salt and pepper hair was impeccably groomed, and whose navy blue vest bore the golden wings of a senior crew member. His smile when he first saw Imani did not quite reach his eyes, and there was a moment, just a flicker really, when his professional mask slipped enough to reveal surprise and perhaps a trace of displeasure at seeing a young black girl occupying a premium seat. But years of training in customer service helped him recover quickly, and he offered her a plastic smile and a cursory welcome aboard before moving on to greet other boarding passengers with noticeably more warmth. Imani noticed, but tried not to let it bother her. She was accustomed to these microaggressions, these tiny moments where she could feel herself being assessed and found somehow lacking or out of place. Her therapist, whom she had started seeing after experiencing bullying at her predominantly white boarding school, called it chronic othering. The exhausting experience of constantly being made to feel like you did not quite belong. The passenger manifest indicated that the seat beside her, 2B, was occupied, and Imani felt a flutter of nervousness, wondering who her seatmate would be. That question was answered moments later when Patricia Whitmore swept into the first-class cabin like a queen entering her throne room. Everything about Patricia screamed wealth and entitlement. From her platinum blonde hair styled in a perfect bob that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, to her cream-colored Chanel suit with its signature gold buttons, to the Hermes Birkin bag dangling from her manicured hand, to the massive diamond studs winking in her ears. Patricia was the kind of woman who had never been told no, never been denied entry, never been made to feel that she did not belong. At 45 years old, she held the position of vice president at Whitmore Financial Group, a company her father had founded and which bore the family name, giving her a sense of aristocratic privilege that extended into every interaction. When Patricia's eyes landed on Imani sitting in seat 2A, her entire body went rigid. She stopped mid-stride, her mouth opening in visible shock, as though she had encountered something utterly unexpected and unwelcome. Her gaze traveled from Imani's face to the seat number on her own boarding pass, then back to the child, her expression shifting through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, disbelief, disgust, and finally, indignant anger. Without preamble or attempt at politeness, Patricia's voice rang out across the cabin, shrill with outrage. "Excuse me, there must be some mistake." Several passengers who had been settling into their seats looked up, and the quiet murmur of pre-flight activity began to fade as people tuned in to the brewing conflict. Gerald materialized almost instantly, his professional smile firmly in place. "How may I help you, ma'am?" Patricia pointed at Imani, as though the child were an inanimate object rather than a human being. "Why is this child sitting in first class? And in the seat next to mine?" The emphasis she placed on the word child carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with race. Imani felt her face grow hot, her hands clenching into fists in her lap as she stared straight ahead, trying to make herself invisible. Gerald requested to see Imani's boarding pass, and with shaking hands, she retrieved it from the seat pocket and handed it over. He examined it carefully, double-checked his tablet, and confirmed what was already obvious. "Her ticket is valid, ma'am. Seat 2A is correctly assigned." His tone remained neutral, but there was a slight edge of discomfort in his voice, as though he sensed where this situation was heading, and wished he could be anywhere else. Patricia's face flushed an ugly shade of red that clashed with her expensive suit. Her voice rose several decibels, abandoning any pretense of discretion. "I don't care. I paid $5,000 for this ticket." "I refuse to sit next to her." She did not say the word that was clearly on the tip of her tongue, the racial slur that polite society had supposedly relegated to the dustbin of history but which still lived in the hearts and minds of people like Patricia Whitmore. She did not need to say it. Her tone, her body language, the curl of her lip, all communicated more effectively than any slur could have. The other passengers in first class had gone completely silent now, some staring openly at the spectacle, others pretending to be absorbed in their phones while clearly listening to every word. Not a single person spoke up in Imana's defense. Not one passenger said, "She's just a child. Leave her alone." The silence of witnesses to injustice can be as damaging as the injustice itself. And in that moment, Imani learned another painful lesson about how the world works. Gerald found himself caught between competing pressures. Company policy was clear. Passengers could not be moved, simply because another passenger did not like them. But company culture was equally clear. Wealthy, repeat customers were to be kept happy whenever possible, and causing a scene that might delay departure was to be avoided at all costs. He attempted a compromise. "Mom, I understand your concern, but all seats are occupied. Perhaps we could." Patricia cut him off, with the righteous fury of someone who had never been denied. "No. Either she moves, or I'm calling my lawyer and posting this on social media. Do you know who I am? Patricia Whitmore, VP of Whitmore Financial Group." The threat of social media and legal action worked like magic. Gerald's expression shifted from uncomfortable to calculating. In his mind, the equation was simple: one angry, wealthy white woman versus one quiet black child. The choice seemed obvious. Imani finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I have the right to sit here. My dad bought this ticket." Her words were brave, but her trembling lip betrayed her fear. Patricia laughed, a harsh bark of derision that made several passengers wince. "Your dad? Sure, honey. Did he steal the credit card?" The cruelty of the accusation, the casual racism embedded in the assumption that a black man could not legitimately afford a first-class ticket for his daughter, hung in the air like poison gas. A few passengers actually chuckled, finding humor in Patricia's vicious mockery. Others looked away, their discomfort evident, but not strong enough to compel them to speak up. One elderly white woman in seat 4B shook her head disapprovingly. But when Imana's eyes met hers, hoping for an ally, the woman simply looked down at her magazine. Gerald made his decision. "I'll speak with the captain. Please remain calm, everyone." As he walked toward the cockpit, Patricia made a show of sitting down in seat 2B, but not before pulling an antibacterial wipe from her purse and scrubbing down the armrest between her seat and Imana's, as though proximity to the child might contaminate her. The symbolism was not lost on anyone watching. Imani sat frozen, her iPad forgotten in her lap, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her, as she willed herself not to cry in front of these people. She could feel Patricia's hostile presence beside her, could hear the woman's exaggerated sighs of disgust, could sense the eyes of other passengers burning into her back. In that moment, Imani Washington felt more alone than she had ever felt in her 12 years of life, suspended 30,000 feet above the earth in a metal tube full of people who had decided she did not belong. Captain Raymond Tiller had flown commercial aircraft for 32 years, accumulating over 20,000 flight hours, and a reputation as a strict adherent to protocol and chain of command. At 58 years old, with gray threading through his close-cropped hair and a face weathered by decades of pressurized cabin air, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the final decision-maker in high-stakes situations. His uniform bore the 4 gold stripes of a senior captain, and his bearing suggested a man who took his responsibilities seriously, though perhaps his definition of responsibility was narrower than it should have been. When Gerald knocked on the cockpit door and explained the situation in hushed, urgent tones, Raymond's first instinct was not to question whether the complaint had merit, but rather to calculate which solution would cause the least disruption to his flight schedule. In his mental framework, shaped by decades of operating in an industry that prioritized efficiency and customer satisfaction over justice or fairness, The answer seemed clear. Raymond emerged from the cockpit with his captain's hat tucked under his arm, projecting an image of calm authority as he entered the first-class cabin. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in Patricia's flushed, angry face, Gerald's nervous hovering, and finally landing on Imani, who sat rigid in her seat, her hands clutched together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Raymond had made split-second decisions about equipment failures, weather diversions, and medical emergencies during his career. But this situation felt different, more loaded with potential consequences that extended beyond the technical. Still, his worldview, shaped by growing up in rural Georgia in the 1970s and never seriously challenged by meaningful exposure to different perspectives, led him to see this as a simple customer service issue rather than a moral test. In his mind, he was being pragmatic, not prejudiced, though the two are often indistinguishable in their effects. "Young lady, can you come with me for a moment?" Raymond's tone was not unkind, exactly, but it carried the firm expectation of obedience that adults use with children they do not quite trust. Imani looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Did I do something wrong, sir?" Her voice wavered on the last word, the question containing within it a desperate hope that this was all some misunderstanding that could be quickly cleared up. Raymond did not answer directly because he could not honestly say she had done anything wrong, and some part of him, some deeply buried ember of conscience, recognized that fact. Instead, he deflected, "We need to verify some information. Please bring your belongings." The word verify was doing a lot of work in that sentence, disguising the reality that no actual verification was necessary, that her ticket and identification had already been checked multiple times, that what was really happening was a capitulation to racist intimidation masquerading as procedural caution. As Imani slowly stood and reached for her backpack, Patricia could not resist a final jab. Finally, some professionalism. She actually applauded, her hands coming together in slow, sarcastic claps that echoed obscenely in the quiet cabin. A few passengers, emboldened by her display, chuckled or nodded approvingly, their complicity in this injustice now openly declared. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats but maintained their silence, perhaps telling themselves that this was not their problem, that they should not get involved, that there were probably reasons beyond what they could see that justified what was happening. This is how systemic racism perpetuates itself, not primarily through the actions of obvious bigots like Patricia, but through the passive acceptance of everyone else who witnesses injustice and does nothing. Raymond led Imani to the galley area between first class and business, where two flight attendants, Lorna Davies and Kurt Zimmerman, were preparing beverage carts for the service. Lorna, a 32-year-old brunette with kind eyes, looked up as they approached, and her expression immediately registered concern when she saw the tears beginning to track down Imani's cheeks. Kurt, by contrast, barely glanced up from his work, his disinterest in the situation evident in the way he continued counting many bottles of liquor. Raymond positioned himself between Imani and the view of the cabin, creating an illusion of privacy for what was about to be a deeply humiliating interrogation. "Sweetie, who really bought this ticket for you?" The question itself was an accusation, the emphasis on really implying that her previous answers had been lies. Imani took a shaky breath, trying to channel the dignity her father had always modeled for her. "My father, sir, Darius Washington, has the CEO of Washington Aerospace Technologies. You can call him. You can verify everything. I'm not lying." Raymond's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Washington Aerospace Technologies, a company he vaguely recognized from business news. But his skepticism remained firmly in place. In his experience, children exaggerated their parents' importance, and the specificity of her answer might just as easily be a detailed fiction as the truth. More importantly, he had already mentally committed to a course of action, and cognitive dissonance made it difficult for him to reverse that decision without admitting error. Sure. Look, we've had issues with stolen credit cards before. You're very young to be flying alone in first class. Are you certain this ticket is legitimate? Each question was a fresh wound, implying criminality, deceit, and unworthiness. Imani's tears flowed freely now, her composure finally breaking under the weight of accumulated injustice. "Yes, sir. I can call my dad," Hel explained. She fumbled for her phone, but of course, it was in airplane mode, the device as useless in that moment as her pleas for fair treatment. Lorna finally spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "Captain, maybe we should wait until we can contact her guardian? She's clearly telling the truth." Lorna had been watching Imani's face, recognizing the authentic distress of a child being unjustly accused, and her maternal instincts overrode her deference to authority. But Raymond shook his head. His decision made. "We're already delayed. We can't have a disruption in first class. The passenger in 2B is a valued customer. This is my call." The euphemism "valued customer" did not need translation. Everyone present understood its meaning. Patricia Whitmore's comfort mattered more than Imani Washington's dignity. Kurt, who had been silently listening, finally chimed in with his support. "Yeah, the kid will be fine in economy. Plenty of room back there." His casual dismissal of Imani's experience, his reduction of profound injustice to a mere seating change, exemplified the banality of everyday racism. What followed was a walk of shame that Imani would remember for the rest of her life. Raymond personally escorted her from the galley through business class, where passengers looked up from their laptops and magazines with curious expressions, and finally into economy, where the seats were narrower, the lighting harsher, and the atmosphere entirely different from the cocoon of privilege she had left behind. Passengers whispered as she passed, some with sympathy, others with judgment. Many simply curious about what this young black girl had done to merit such obvious disgrace. Imani kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her backpack clutched to her chest like armor, her whole body trembling with the effort of not completely breaking down in front of hundreds of strangers. Raymond deposited her in seat 38C, a middle seat between two large men, and, without further comment, returned to his cockpit to prepare for departure. Imani squeezed herself into the cramped space, feeling the armrests dig into her sides, acutely aware of how small and powerless she was. The man to her left, absorbed in a thriller novel, did not even glance at her. The man to her right, wearing headphones, nodded briefly in acknowledgement before closing his eyes. Neither of them knew or cared about the injustice that had just occurred. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Imani finally allowed herself to fully cry, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs as the aircraft engines roared to life. She had tried to be strong, tried to do everything right, tried to prove she belonged, and still, she had been found wanting. Still, she had been judged by the color of her skin rather than the content of her character. In that cramped middle seat in row 38, Imani Washington learned what millions of black people before her had learned, that American society would promise her equality while systematically denying it, would tell her she could sit anywhere while forcibly removing her from where she belonged. The flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles typically takes 4 hours and 45 minutes, and every minute of that journey felt like an eternity to Imani. She sat motionless in her cramped seat, staring at nothing, her mind replaying the humiliation over and over like a nightmare she could not escape. The tears had finally stopped, leaving behind puffy eyes and a hollow feeling in her chest that she had never experienced before. This was not like the teasing she had endured at school, which hurt but felt somehow temporary and manageable. This was different. This was being told by adults, by people in positions of authority, by the systems that supposedly protected everyone equally, that she was lesser, that her rights were negotiable, that her presence in spaces of dignity was conditional upon the approval of white people who did not want her there. At 12 years old, Imani was being forced to confront truths that many adults spend their whole lives avoiding. Her thoughts turned to her father, and the memory of his words became both comfort and torment. Darius Washington had always been her hero, the man who had built a multi-million-dollar aerospace technology company from nothing, who employed over 2,000 people, who had been featured in Forbes and Black Enterprise, who proved through his very existence that Black excellence was real and achievable. He had taught her that she could be anything, go anywhere, achieve any dream she could imagine. "Baby girl," he would say, his deep voice filled with conviction, "the world won't always be fair to you because of how you look, but you are smart, you are strong, and you are worthy. Never let anyone make you feel less." Those words, which had once felt like an impenetrable shield, now seemed like a cruel lie. She had been strong, she had been polite, she had done everything right. And still, she had been humiliated, displaced, and implicitly called a liar and a thief. Had her father been wrong? Or was the world just too broken to be fixed by individual strength and dignity? A gentle voice interrupted her spiral of despair. "Sweetie, are you okay?" Imani looked up to see a black woman in her early 40s, leaning forward from the seat directly behind her. Concern etched deeply into her warm brown face. The woman had natural hair styled in a beautiful twist-out, wore a red turtleneck sweater, and had eyes that radiated both kindness and knowing. Her name was Clarice Booker, and she had been sitting in business class, but had witnessed the entire shameful procession when Imani was escorted past her seat. Clarice was a high school principal in Detroit, a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting and advocating for children, and everything about what she had seen violated her sense of justice so profoundly that she could not remain silent. She had deliberately moved to this economy seat, claiming a need to retrieve something from her carry-on bag, but really positioning herself where she could check on this child who had been so publicly wronged. Through fresh tears, Imani told Clarice everything, her words tumbling out in a rush of pent-up emotion. She described Brenda's interrogation at check-in, Patricia's vicious mockery, Gerald's complicit silence, Raymond's authoritarian dismissal of her rights. With each detail, Clarice's expression grew darker, her jaw tightening with righteous anger. When Imani mentioned her father's name, Clarice actually gasped. "Wait, the Darius Washington? The billionaire who just donated $50 million to STEM education for black kids? Who was on the cover of Forbes last month?" Imani nodded miserably, and for a moment, Clarice sat back in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. These people had humiliated the daughter of one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in America, a man whose company held contracts with NASA, Boeing, and the Department of Defense, a man whose wealth and influence far exceeded their petty suburban prejudices. "Oh, honey," Clarice finally said, reaching through the gap between seats to squeeze Imani's hand, "when your daddy finds out, heads are gonna roll, don't you worry." The physical contact, the maternal warmth in Clarice's voice, the validation that what had happened was genuinely wrong and not somehow Imani's fault, all combined to provide the first measure of comfort Imani had felt since boarding. Clarice pulled out her phone and, in a whisper, told Imani that she had recorded video of the incident, including Patricia's racist comments and Raymond's removal of Imani from first class. "I'm going to send this to your father," Clarice said firmly. "Do you know his email?" Imani recited the address, and Clarice immediately composed a message detailing everything she had witnessed, attaching the video files. When the plane's Wi-Fi activated at cruising altitude, the message sent, winging its way through cyberspace toward a man who was about to become very, very angry. Clarice then settled in for the rest of the flight, periodically checking on Imani, offering snacks from her bag, and providing a steady stream of reassurance that justice would be served. Meanwhile, in first class, Patricia Whitmore was thoroughly enjoying her victory. She had ordered champagne the moment the seatbelt sign turned off, and was now on her second glass, regaling her seatmate, a white businessman named Maxwell Dorsey, with her version of events. "Can you believe they let just anyone buy first-class tickets these days?" she said, her voice carrying across the cabin with the confidence of someone who believed her bigotry was shared by all right-thinking people. Thank God the captain handled it. I mean, really. These children need to learn their place. Maxwell, a real estate developer from Phoenix, who held similarly regressive views about race and class, nodded vigorously. Absolutely. Standards must be maintained. That's what first class is about. After all, a certain level of refinement. He did not say whiteness, but the implication hung heavy in the air. They clinked their champagne flutes together, toasting their successful defense of racial segregation, completely unaware that their conversation was being noted by other passengers who did not share their views. In the galley, Lorna Davies poured coffee for business-class passengers with shaking hands, her mind troubled by what had transpired. She kept replaying the scene in her head, the look of absolute devastation on that little girl's face, the way her small body had seemed to fold in on itself, under the weight of undeserved shame. Lorna had been a flight attendant for 8 years, and she had seen her share of difficult situations, but this felt different. This felt like a line had been crossed, a violation of basic human decency disguised as policy enforcement. She cornered Gerald during a quiet moment and whispered fiercely, "That was wrong. That child didn't do anything." Gerald, uncomfortable with the confrontation, tried to deflect responsibility. "Raymond made the call. Has been captain for 3 decades. We can't question his decisions." But Lorna would not be dismissed so easily. "I don't care how long has been flying. What we did to that girl was racist and cruel, and you know it." Their whispered argument was interrupted by Kurt, who had overheard and now inserted himself with characteristic insensitivity. "Oh, come on. Stop being so dramatic. The kid's fine. She's probably made up half that story anyway. These people always exaggerate." The phrase, "these people," needed no clarification. Everyone knew exactly which people he meant. Lorna stared at Kurt with open disgust, suddenly seeing her colleague with new clarity. How many times had he made similar comments that she had let slide? How often had she remained silent in the face of casual racism, because confronting it felt uncomfortable? In that moment, Lorna made a decision. When this flight landed, she would file a formal report about what had happened. She would go on record. She would speak the truth, even if it cost her professionally. Some things were more important than keeping the peace or protecting her job security. That little girl in row 38 deserved someone to stand up for her, even if it came too late to prevent her pain. As the aircraft droned westward, cruising at 39,000 feet above a landscape of clouds and late afternoon sunlight, Imani tried to sleep but found herself unable to quiet her mind. She kept imagining her father's disappointment when he learned what had happened. Would he be angry at her for not fighting harder? Would he be ashamed that his daughter had allowed herself to be treated this way? These were irrational fears, she knew even then. But trauma has a way of distorting thought patterns, making victims question themselves rather than their oppressors. She did not yet understand that she bore no responsibility for other people's racism, that nothing she could have said or done would have changed the outcome, that the fault lay entirely with those who had chosen prejudice over principle. Those lessons would come later, through therapy and time and her father's fierce love. For now, she simply endured, watching the minutes tick by on the seatback screen, counting down to landing, to her father, to the moment when she could finally feel safe again. "Now, I want to hear from you," Comment number 1 if you believe Captain Raymond made the wrong decision. Or comment number 2 if you think he was just trying to keep the peace. Hit that like button if you're as angry as I am about how Imani was treated, and make sure you're subscribed, because you won't believe what happens when this billionaire father finds out what they did to his little girl. The question is, when Darius Washington gets that video from Clarice, what will he do? Will it be enough to simply complain to the airline, or is something much bigger about to go down? Let's find out. The wheels of Flight 1847 chirped against the tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport at exactly 6:43 p.m. Pacific Time, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, despite the departure delay in Atlanta. For most passengers, the landing represented the routine conclusion of a transcontinental flight, a transition point between the suspended reality of air travel and the resumption of normal life. For Imani, it marked the end of the most traumatic experience of her young life and the beginning of something she could not yet foresee. As the aircraft taxied toward Gate 52 inches Terminal 5, she gathered her belongings with hands that had finally stopped shaking, though her eyes remained red and swollen from hours of intermittent crying. Clarice reached forward one last time to squeeze her shoulder. "Remember, baby girl, you did nothing wrong. Hold your head up." Imani tried to smile but could not quite manage it, offering instead a small nod of gratitude before joining the queue of passengers shuffling toward the exit. First-class passengers, as always, disembarked first, and Patricia Whitmore swept past the cockpit with her designer luggage and self-satisfied smile, pausing to shake Gerald's hand. "Thank you for handling that situation so professionally. It's wonderful to see airlines maintaining proper standards." Gerald, who had spent the latter part of the flight wrestling with growing unease about what they had done, managed only a tight smile in return. Raymond remained in the cockpit, working through his post-flight checklist with the co-pilot, already mentally transitioning to thoughts of home, dinner, and the Braves game he planned to watch that evening. None of them had any inkling that their lives were about to change irrevocably, that the machinery of consequences had already been set in motion, and was now accelerating toward them with the inevitability of gravity. As Imani stepped off the aircraft into the climate-controlled jetway, she saw him. Darius Washington stood at the gate entrance like a pillar of strength, his 6'3" frame impossible to miss even in the crowd of people waiting for arriving passengers. He was dressed in the kind of casual elegance that whispered wealth, rather than shouting it, a charcoal gray suit by Tom Ford that fit his athletic build perfectly, crisp white shirt open at the collar, no tie, a Patek Philippe watch catching the light on his wrist. His head was shaved smooth, his skin a deep, rich brown, his jaw strong and set in an expression that combined parental worry with barely contained rage. Those who knew Darius well could read the signs: the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped behind his back as though restraining himself, the measured breathing of someone fighting to maintain composure. When his eyes found Imani emerging from economy rather than first class as he had anticipated, when he took in her tear-stained face and hunched shoulders, and the way she seemed to have diminished somehow since he had last seen her 3 months ago, something primal and protective surged through him with volcanic force. Every instinct screamed at him to immediately destroy whoever had hurt his child. But years of navigating corporate boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations had taught him the value of controlled fury over explosive anger. Still, his eyes went cold, his jaw tightened, and several passengers unconsciously gave him a wide berth, sensing the dangerous energy radiating from this man who stood so perfectly still. "Daddy." Imani's voice cracked on the word, and then she was running, dropping all pretense of composure, throwing herself into her father's arms with the desperate relief of someone who had been drowning and finally found air. Darius caught her, held her, felt her body shaking with sobs against his chest, and in that moment, He made a silent vow that everyone who had contributed to his daughter's tears would pay a price so steep they would remember it for the rest of their lives. He said nothing at first, just held her, one large hand cradling the back of her head, the other arm wrapped protectively around her small frame. He let her cry, let her release the poison of humiliation and fear, all while his mind began calculating angles of attack with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. When Amana's sobs finally subsided enough for speech, Darius gently guided her to a quieter corner of the gate area and knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. "Tell me everything, baby girl. Start from the beginning." And she did. Through hiccuping breaths and fresh tears, Imani recounted every detail. Brenda's suspicion and delay at check-in, Patricia's venomous rejection on the aircraft, Gerald's complicity, Raymond's authoritarian dismissal of her rights, the walk of shame through the plane, the lonely horror of being treated like a criminal for the crime of existing while black. Darius listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim, though he made sure to keep his voice gentle when he asked clarifying questions. What was the captain's name? And the woman who complained? When Imani provided the names Raymond Tiller and Patricia Whitmore, Darius immediately pulled out his phone and created a note, typing the names with his thumbs, adding additional names as Imani mentioned them: Gerald Pemberton, Brenda Hutchins, Kurt Zimmerman. As if summoned by the telling of her story, Clarice Booker appeared, having deliberately waited to ensure she could speak with Darius. "Mr. Washington? I'm Clarice Booker. I sat behind your daughter on the flight. What they did to her was absolutely disgusting. And I have video evidence." She extended her phone toward him, and Darius took it with the careful handling of someone who understood he was being handed a weapon. The video quality was excellent, Clarice having positioned her phone discreetly but effectively to capture both audio and visual evidence. Darius watched Patricia's face twist with disgust as she pointed at his daughter and said, "I refuse to sit next to that in first class." He heard her mocking accusation. "Your dad?" "Sure, honey. Did he steal the credit card?" He saw Raymond leading Imani away, saw the resignation in his daughter's posture, saw the curious and judgmental stares of passengers. When the video ended, Darius looked up at Clarice with an expression that made her take an involuntary step backward despite knowing his anger was not directed at her. "Thank you, ma'am. This will be very useful. Can I have your contact information? You may be called as a witness." Clarice readily provided her email and phone number, adding, "I'm a school principal. I work with children every day. What they did to your daughter violated every principle of basic decency. I will gladly testify, speak to media, whatever you need." She crouched down to Imani's level, her voice softening. "You're a brave girl, sweetheart. Don't ever let them break you. You are going places in this world, and small-minded people like them can't stop you." Imani managed a small smile, the first since boarding the plane, and Clarice stood, shook Darius' hand firmly, and departed with the bearing of someone who had done the right thing and knew it. Darius led Imani toward baggage claim, but before they reached the escalator, he paused to make a phone call. "Ted, I need you at LAX Terminal 5 immediately. We have a major civil rights violation, discrimination against a minor, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Bring the PR team too. I want a full strategy session within the hour." Theodore Crane, Darius' personal attorney and a partner at one of Los Angeles' most prestigious law firms, did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply confirmed he would be there in 45 minutes and hung up. The next call was to Vanessa Chen, CEO of Chen & Associates Strategic Communications, the premier crisis management and public relations firm in California. "Vanessa, Darius Washington, I need your team on standby for what's going to be the biggest discrimination story of the year. My daughter, an airline. Very bad decisions on their part. How fast can you mobilize? Vanessa, who had known Darius for 15 years and recognized the steel in his voice, assured him she could have a team ready within 2 hours. As they descended the escalator toward baggage claim, Darius' mind was already several moves ahead, anticipating responses and preparing countermoves. He would not simply sue. Money alone would not adequately address what had been done to Imani. He wanted systemic change, public accountability, and personal consequences for every single person who had participated in or enabled his daughter's humiliation. Most importantly, he wanted the world to see this incident, to confront the reality that racial discrimination in America was not some relic of history but an ongoing, everyday occurrence that Black families navigated constantly. His daughter's pain would not be meaningless. He would transform it into a catalyst for change, a lesson that would reverberate far beyond this airport, this airline, these individuals. As they reached the baggage carousel, Darius spotted Patricia Whitmore standing nearby, phone pressed to her ear, laughing about something. Gerald was visible near the airline employee entrance, retrieving his crew luggage. Perfect. Let them enjoy these last few moments of normalcy. The reckoning was about to begin. Patricia's laughter died in her throat when she turned and found herself face to face with Darius Washington. She had been mid-conversation with her husband, describing her successful defense of standards on the flight, when she became aware of a large, imposing figure standing uncomfortably close to her personal space. Her first reaction was annoyance at this invasion of her bubble. Her second was to look up, and her third was a jolt of recognition as she realized the man towering over her was unmistakably the father of the child she had tormented. Even without the physical resemblance, the way Imani stood slightly behind him, her small hand gripping his suit jacket, made the connection obvious. Patricia's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, dawning comprehension, and finally, poorly concealed apprehension, masquerading as indignation. "Excuse me, are you Patricia Whitmore?" Darius' voice was conversational, even pleasant, but there was something in his tone that made Patricia's fight-or-flight response activate, her body tensing as though preparing for physical threat even though Darius had made no aggressive movement. Around them, other passengers had begun to take notice of the interaction, several pulling out phones, drawn by the unmistakable electricity of impending confrontation. Patricia drew herself up to her full 5'6" height, trying to project authority and confidence. "Yes? And you are?" She kept her voice cool, dismissive, the tone of someone accustomed to speaking to subordinates rather than equals. But there was a tremor at the edges that betrayed her growing nervousness. "Darius Washington, CEO of Washington Aerospace Technologies. And this is my daughter, Imani, whom you had removed from her first-class seat because you objected to sitting next to a black child." He delivered the statement with prosecutorial precision, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. The nearby passengers who had been pretending not to listen now abandoned all pretense, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Several phones were now openly recording, capturing every word, every facial expression, every moment of what was rapidly becoming a very public accounting. Patricia's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I don't know what you're talking about. I simply requested a seat change due to safety concerns. The child was unsupervised, and Darius cut her off with a single raised hand, the gesture somehow more intimidating than shouting. "Don't lie to me. I have video evidence. Multiple witnesses. You called my daughter that. You accused her father of credit card theft. You mocked and humiliated a 12-year-old child for no reason other than the color of her skin. You violated federal anti-discrimination laws, airline policy, and basic human decency." His voice remained level, but it carried such authority that Patricia actually took a step backward, bumping into her expensive luggage. The crowd around them had grown larger, a mix of deplaning passengers and airport staff drawn by the commotion. A security guard pushed through the gathering crowd, assessing the situation. But when he saw Darius' stance and demeanor radiating controlled intensity rather than threat, he positioned himself nearby without intervening. Patricia attempted to rally her defense, her voice rising to a near shriek. "Look, I paid for first class! I have the right to be comfortable!" She was unsupervised. I was concerned about safety. Each excuse sounded more hollow than the last. And the crowd was clearly not buying what she was selling. Several people had begun to mutter audibly, their sympathies clearly with the well-dressed black man and the tearful child rather than the increasingly frantic white woman. Darius' response was devastating in its calm precision. Safety? She had all proper paperwork. She's flown alone before. She was sitting quietly, reading on her iPad, bothering absolutely no one. The only reason you complained was because she's black. Say it. Admit what you did. Patricia's face contorted, caught between the truth and her desperate need to maintain plausible deniability. How dare you accuse me of racism? I have black friends. I donate to charity. This is outrageous. You're the one being aggressive right now. She tried to flip the script, to paint herself as the victim of an angry black man's intimidation, a tactic as old as American racism itself. But in the age of smartphone videos and social media accountability, such manipulation had become far more difficult to execute successfully. At that moment, Theodore Crane arrived with remarkable timing, striding through the crowd with 2 associates in tow and a professional videographer trailing behind. Theodore was an imposing figure himself, 52 years old, a white man who had built his reputation on high-stakes civil rights litigation, with a face that had been described by opposing counsel as too honest for his own good and a track record that included 8-figure settlements against Fortune 500 companies. "Mr. Washington, we're here. I see you've already initiated contact with one of the defendants." Theodore's use of legal terminology was deliberate, a signal that this was no longer a personal dispute, but the opening salvo of formal litigation. The videographer began filming everything, a professional camera capturing higher quality footage than the smartphone videos already circulating. Darius nodded to his attorney before turning back to Patricia. "Miss Whitmore, you will be named in a civil lawsuit for racial discrimination, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We will be seeking compensatory and punitive damages. Furthermore, I will personally ensure that your employer is made aware of your behavior and provided with full documentation." Patricia's face went from red to white, all her bluster evaporating in an instant. "You can't do that. I have rights. I'll sue you for harassment." But her threats lacked conviction. The words of someone who suddenly realized they had made a catastrophic error in judgment and was now scrambling for any possible escape route. Gerald, who had been attempting to slip away unnoticed after retrieving his luggage, found his path blocked by one of Theodore's associates. "Mr. Gerald Pemberton, you're also named as a defendant in the pending litigation. Please don't leave the area." Gerald's face flushed with a mixture of shame and panic. "Sir, I was just doing my job." The captain made the decision. "I was following orders." The phrase "following orders" hung in the air with all its historical baggage, and several people in the crowd audibly scoffed at the defense. Darius turned his attention to the flight attendant, his voice growing colder. "You facilitated discrimination. When a child was being victimized, you had a choice to stand up for what was right. You chose to side with bigotry because it was easier and because the victim was black. That makes you complicit. That makes you guilty." The crowd had grown even larger now, and the dynamic had shifted from curious observation to active participation. People were shouting encouragement to Darius. "That's right. Tell them. My daughter shouldn't have to go through this. Sue them for everything." A young black woman pushed to the front, tears streaming down her face, and addressed Imani directly. "Baby girl, I see you. You matter. You belong. Don't let these people make you think otherwise." Imani, who had been standing silently behind her father, peeked around him and gave the woman a tremulous smile. A moment of connection between strangers united by shared experience of systemic oppression. Darius pulled out his phone and placed a call on speaker so everyone could hear. After 2 rings, a professional female voice answered. "United Global Airlines corporate office. How may I direct your call?" Darius identified himself and asked to speak with the most senior executive available at LAX. There was a brief hold, some confused scrambling audible in the background, and then a new voice came on the line. Identifying himself as Gregory Matheson, Regional Director of Operations for the Western United States. Before Gregory could launch into whatever prepared corporate response he had been formulating, Darius cut to the chase. "Mr. Matheson, this is Darius Washington, CEO of Washington Aerospace Technologies. I'm standing in your baggage claim area with my 12-year-old daughter, who was racially discriminated against on Flight 1847 from Atlanta. She was removed from her first-class seat because another passenger objected to sitting next to a black child. I have video evidence. I have multiple witnesses. And I am terminating Washington Aerospace's $75 million contract for aircraft interior components, effective immediately." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for several heartbeats, during which Gregory was presumably calculating the catastrophic implications of what he had just heard. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its corporate smoothness. "Mr. Washington, we had no idea. Please, can we discuss this? I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." But Darius was unmoved. "There's no misunderstanding. Your captain, your crew, your systems, all failed my daughter. You chose a racist passenger's comfort over a child's civil rights. And now you'll pay the price. My attorneys will be in touch regarding the lawsuit. Your PR team should prepare for the media storm. And you've lost my company's business permanently. There are plenty of other suppliers who would be grateful for a $75 million contract." Patricia had sunk down onto a nearby bench, her head in her hands, the reality of her situation finally penetrating her bubble of privilege. Gerald stood frozen, his mind clearly racing through the implications for his career, his pension, his reputation. Around them, the crowd continued to record, and several people had already begun posting to social media, tags like #first-class racism and #justice for Imani beginning to trend even before Darius and his daughter left the airport. An airline supervisor had arrived and was attempting damage control, offering profuse apologies that Darius waved away with undisguised contempt. "Save your apologies. You'll be hearing from my lawyers." He took Imani's hand, nodded to Theodore, and walked out of the terminal into the cool Los Angeles evening, leaving behind a tableau of shocked faces and the smoldering wreckage of several careers. Within 2 hours of Darius and Imani leaving LAX, the videos began to circulate with the exponential velocity that only social media can achieve. The first post came from Clarice Booker, who uploaded her footage to Twitter with the caption, "This 2-year-old girl was humiliated and removed from her first-class seat because a racist passenger complained about sitting next to a black child. This is America in 2024. This is why we can't stop talking about race. First-class racism, justice for Imani." The video, crystal clear and damning, showed Patricia's contorted face as she spat out her complaints, showed Captain Raymond's dismissive authority as he led Imani away, captured the moment when a child's dignity was sacrificed on the altar of white comfort. The second wave of videos came from passengers at baggage claim, multiple angles of Darius' confrontation with Patricia and Gerald, the audio picking up his controlled fury and their pathetic attempts at justification. A particularly powerful clip showed Imani's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, as she stood behind her father. A visual representation of innocence violated that no viewer could ignore. By midnight, the hashtag number first-class racism had been tweeted over 200,000 times. By morning, it had crossed 1 million. Major news outlets picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled, "Discrimination at 30,000 feet." MSNBC brought on civil rights attorneys to discuss the legal implications. Fox News attempted to downplay it but faced immediate backlash from their own viewers who had seen the videos and recognized injustice when they confronted it. Patricia Whitmore's life unraveled with stunning speed. Internet sleuths, mobilized by righteous anger, identified her within hours, posting her LinkedIn profile, her company information, even photos from her social media accounts showing her at charity galas and society events, images that now appeared grotesquely hypocritical given her actions on the plane. The phones at Whitmore Financial Group began ringing incessantly, thousands of calls from outraged citizens demanding Patricia's termination. The company's social media accounts were flooded with comments, one-star reviews, threats of boycotts. Patricia's father, Harold Whitmore, the company's founder and CEO, called an emergency board meeting at 11 p.m. on the night the story broke. The decision was unanimous and immediate. Patricia was to be terminated effective immediately, with no severance package, and the company would issue a public apology, dissociating themselves from her actions. The statement came at 3 a.m. Eastern Time. Whitmore Financial Group does not tolerate discrimination in any form. The actions of Patricia Whitmore, who has been terminated from her position as vice president, do not reflect the values of our organization. We apologize unreservedly to Mr. Darius Washington and his daughter Imani for the harm caused. We are implementing immediate, company-wide anti-discrimination training and establishing a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing business degrees. There is no place in our company or our society for the prejudice displayed in the videos circulating online. The speed and severity of the response was driven partly by genuine corporate horror at what Patricia had done, but primarily by the cold calculation that the company's survival depended on decisive action and public contrition. Patricia attempted to call her father 27 times that night. He never answered. Her friends and colleagues, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quietly unfollowed her on social media and left her text messages on read. By dawn, she had deactivated all her social media accounts, but the internet never forgets. Screenshots of her past posts were being analyzed for evidence of racism, and while most were benign society photos, a few revealed telling patterns. No black people at her social gatherings, tone-deaf comments about urban issues, an old post from college that used a racial slur in what she apparently thought was a humorous context. Each discovery added fuel to the fire, creating a comprehensive portrait of privilege unchecked and prejudice unexamined. Gerald Pemberton's fate was similarly swift. United Global Airlines, facing the most damaging public relations crisis in its history and the loss of a $75 million corporate contract, responded with draconian efficiency. Gerald was suspended without pay pending an internal investigation, a euphemism for the brief interval before formal termination. His union representative argued that he had been following the captain's orders, but the airline's legal team, terrified of liability, determined that Gerald's visible participation in the discrimination and his failure to advocate for the passenger made him indefensible. He was terminated within 48 hours. His wife, who had not worked in 15 years, stared at him across their kitchen table, and asked quietly how they would pay the mortgage, put their 2 kids through college, maintain the comfortable middle-class life they had built. Gerald had no answer. He had thrown away a 32-year career for the sake of not inconveniencing a racist passenger. Captain Raymond Tiller, with his decades of service and presumed authority, believed initially that he might weather the storm. When the airline's investigators contacted him, he maintained that he had made a judgment call in the interest of flight safety and schedule adherence, that he had acted within his authority as captain, that hindsight criticism was unfair. His union was prepared to defend him vigorously, citing the extensive discretion afforded to pilots in command. But then the second video emerged, the one from Clarice that showed him interrogating Imani in the galley, his voice dripping with suspicion as he asked who really bought this ticket. His dismissive wave as he said, "We've had issues with stolen credit cards before." The optics were indefensible. The union quietly informed Raymond that while they would go through the motions of representation, he should begin preparing for the end of his career. The termination came on a Tuesday morning, 5 days after the incident. Raymond received a certified letter informing him that he was being dismissed for violation of company anti-discrimination policies, bringing the airline into disrepute and abuse of captain's authority. His pension remained intact, but his flight privileges were permanently revoked. His name would be reported to the FAA, and his professional reputation was destroyed. At 58 years old, Raymond had planned to fly for at least 7 more years, to retire with fanfare and the respect of his peers. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, his photograph appearing in training materials about implicit bias and the consequences of allowing prejudice to override judgment. Brenda Hutchins at the check-in counter had initially escaped scrutiny, but when investigators reviewed her employment record, they discovered a troubling pattern. Complaints from passengers of color about her service, allegations of selective enforcement of policies, notes from supervisors about attitude problems with diverse customers. The incident with Imani was not an isolated lapse, but the latest in a long series of microaggressions and discriminatory behaviors. She was terminated for cause, her application for unemployment benefits contested by the airline's legal team, her career in customer service effectively over. Who would hire a gate agent famous for racially profiling a 12-year-old girl? The social media response was overwhelmingly supportive of Imani. Though, of course, the internet being what it is, there were pockets of resistance. Right-wing commentators tried to make this about cancel culture and mob justice, arguing that Patricia and the others were being unfairly punished for what might have been innocent misunderstandings. But these attempts at both sidesism fell flat in the face of clear video evidence of Patricia's venomous racism and Raymond's autocratic dismissal of a child's rights. Even many conservatives, recognizing the indefensibility of the situation, either remained silent or joined the chorus of condemnation. A few black conservatives attempted to argue that this was being overblown, that real racism was elsewhere, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming consensus that what had happened to Imani was inexcusable regardless of one's political orientation. Darius Washington's Twitter response, posted 3 days after the incident, was retweeted 4.7 million times. "My daughter is 12 years old. She was humiliated, called a thief, and treated like a criminal for the crime of being black in first class." This isn't about cancel culture. This is about consequences for racism. If you can't understand that, you're part of the problem. Black children deserve dignity. Period. The tweet included a photo of Imani at age 8, winning a science fair with a huge smile on her face, a deliberate humanization of the victim that made it impossible to abstract her into a mere symbol or talking point. This was a real child with dreams and talents and a father who loved her fiercely. 1 week after the incident, Lorna Davies, the flight attendant who had expressed discomfort with the situation, posted her own video testimony to YouTube, sitting in her living room, no makeup, voice shaking with emotion. She described what she had witnessed and her shame at not speaking up more forcefully in the moment. "I was on that flight. I saw everything. That little girl did nothing wrong. She was quiet, polite, and completely appropriate. She was targeted because she was black. I should have done more. I should have refused to participate. Am ashamed that I prioritized my job security over a child's dignity. Am sorry, Imani. I'm sorry to every black passenger who has experienced discrimination and seen flight crews stay silent. We can do better. We must do better." The video went viral in its own right, with many commenters praising Lorna for her honesty and accountability. The airline, recognizing a PR opportunity, announced that Lorna would not face discipline and would instead be helping to develop new anti-discrimination training protocols for all staff. Kurt Zimmerman, who had laughed during Patricia's tirade and later dismissed Imani's treatment as no big deal, tried to keep his head down and ride out the storm. But passengers on that flight remembered his casual complicity, and when his behavior was reported to the airline, he too faced suspension and mandatory sensitivity training. His social media accounts revealed a history of racially insensitive posts and jokes, the kind of casual racism that passes for humor in certain circles but looks monstrous when exposed to sunlight. Kurt issued a half-hearted apology through the airline's PR department, but it convinced no one of genuine contrition, reading instead like the desperate words of someone trying to save their job rather than someone who had learned anything meaningful. The airline itself announced a comprehensive overhaul of its policies and procedures. A new task force would be established with members from civil rights organizations, employee representatives, and passenger advocacy groups to review complaints and ensure accountability. Quarterly public reports would detail any discrimination complaints and resolutions. Most significantly, the airline agreed to fund a $10 million scholarship program for students of color pursuing careers in aviation, aerospace, and hospitality, to be administered by an independent foundation. These reforms went far beyond what any lawsuit would have likely achieved, a testament to the power of public pressure and corporate fear of permanent brand damage. The legal proceedings moved forward with methodical precision. Theodore Crane filed a comprehensive lawsuit in federal court, naming Patricia Whitmore, Gerald Pemberton, Raymond Tiller, Brenda Hutchins, Kurt Zimmerman, and United Global Airlines as defendants. The complaint detailed violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the Federal Aviation Administration's anti-discrimination regulations, California's Unruh Civil Rights Act, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent hiring and supervision. The damages sought included compensation for emotional distress, punitive damages designed to punish the defendants and deter similar conduct, and a court order mandating systemic reforms. But Darius, in consultation with civil rights leaders and with Imani's welfare as his primary concern, made a strategic decision. He would offer the individual defendants a way out, conditional on meaningful accountability. 1 month after the incident, a press conference was arranged at a hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Patricia Whitmore, looking haggard and diminished without her designer armor, read a prepared statement that her attorney had undoubtedly crafted but which she delivered with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I was wrong. I let my unconscious biases, my privilege, and my sense of entitlement override my basic humanity. I saw a young black girl in a space I subconsciously believed she didn't belong, and I reacted with cruelty and racism. I caused immense pain to Imani Washington, and I am profoundly ashamed. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. I'm asking for the opportunity to do better, to learn, to change. I've begun therapy specifically focused on examining my racial prejudices. I've enrolled in anti-racism workshops. I'm volunteering with organizations that work against discrimination. These actions can't undo what I did, but they represent my commitment to becoming a person who would never do such a thing again. Imani, if you ever see this, I am so deeply sorry." Gerald Pemberton's apology came via video, as he had relocated to Oregon to live with his sister while he looked for work. His statement was shorter but equally abject. "I had a duty to protect all passengers, but especially a vulnerable child. Instead, I prioritized avoiding conflict with my superior and with a wealthy customer over doing what was right. I told myself I was just following orders, but we all know where that excuse leads. I failed Imani Washington. I failed my profession. I failed the values I thought I held. I'm sorry. And I understand that sorry isn't enough. I will carry the shame of my cowardice for the rest of my life." Captain Raymond Tiller's apology came in the form of a handwritten letter, 5 pages long, that was read aloud at the press conference by Theodore Crane. In it, Raymond detailed his realization that he had allowed his position of authority to insulate him from examining his own biases, that he had made assumptions about Imani based on stereotypes he claimed not to hold, that his decision to move her had been based entirely on appeasing a white passenger's racist complaint, rather than any legitimate safety or policy concern. He wrote about the loss of his career and reputation as deserved consequences, expressed hope that his example would serve as a warning to others, and offered his profound apologies to Imani and her family. The letter concluded, "I thought I was a good person who made a difficult call. I was actually a coward who chose the path of least resistance. That truth is painful, but I must face it. I hope Imani can somehow overcome what I did to her and achieve the brilliant future she deserves." Brenda Hutchins issued a similar apology, acknowledging a pattern of treating passengers of color with suspicion and disrespect, behavior she now recognized as racist regardless of her intentions. She detailed her enrollment in community college courses on African American history and systemic racism, her volunteer work with a local NAACP chapter, her commitment to personal transformation. Like the others, she did not ask for forgiveness, only for the opportunity to demonstrate through sustained action that she could become better than she had been. Darius, after reviewing these apologies with Imani and several trusted advisors, agreed to a settlement that would allow the individual defendants to avoid trial in exchange for these public admissions of wrongdoing, completion of extensive anti-racism education, and participation in a documentary about the incident that would be used for training purposes. The airline agreed to a confidential financial settlement with the Washington family, rumored to be in the mid-7 figures, along with the systemic reforms already announced. Crucially, none of the defendants would face criminal charges, but their public shaming and professional destruction were considered adequate consequences by most observers. But Darius' goals extended beyond punishment. Working with educational institutions, civil rights organizations, and media partners, he helped develop a comprehensive curriculum using Imani's experience as a case study for teaching about modern racism, implicit bias, the importance of speaking up against injustice, and the real-world consequences of discrimination. The curriculum included the videos, the apologies, analysis from psychologists and sociologists, and importantly, testimony from Imani herself. Now 13 years old and having processed much of her trauma through intensive therapy, Imani agreed to share her story publicly in controlled settings, believing that her pain could be transformative for others. Her first major public speech came at a high school in South Los Angeles, invited by Clarice Booker, who had flown out specifically to support Imani through the experience. Standing at a podium before 500 students, mostly Black and Latino kids from working-class families, Imani spoke with a maturity beyond her years. 2 years ago, I was humiliated on an airplane because of my skin color. For a long time, I felt worthless. I felt like maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong in first class. Maybe there was something wrong with me. But my father taught me, and therapy reinforced, that my value isn't determined by the hatred or ignorance of others. It's determined by my character, my choices, and my refusal to internalize their racism. They tried to make me small. Instead, they helped me understand the importance of speaking truth to power, of demanding the dignity that all people deserve. The students erupted in applause, many with tears streaming down their faces, recognizing their own experiences in Imani's words. She continued, her voice strengthening with each sentence. To anyone facing discrimination, I want you to know, you are not crazy. You are not imagining it. Your feelings are valid, and you have the right to take up space, to sit in first class, to excel in advanced programs, to dream big dreams. Don't let their narrow vision limit your infinite potential. Rise, speak, resist. Become so successful that your very existence challenges their assumptions. When she finished, the entire auditorium stood, applause washing over her, in waves of affirmation and solidarity. And Imani felt something she had not felt since before that flight. Pride in who she was, and hope for who she could become. The airline industry as a whole began implementing changes inspired by Imani's case. Training programs were revised to emphasize scenarios involving discrimination and the duty to intervene. Complaint procedures were streamlined to allow passengers to report discrimination in real time. Civil rights organizations were given access to anonymized data about discrimination complaints to provide external accountability. While these changes could not eliminate racism from an industry reflecting the broader society's prejudices, they represented genuine progress, creating mechanisms for accountability that had not previously existed. 1 year after the incident, the quarterly reports from United Global Airlines showed a 60% reduction in upheld discrimination complaints, a statistic attributed to better training, clearer policies, and a cultural shift within the organization. Other airlines, watching closely and eager to avoid similar public relations disasters, implemented their own reforms. The case became a touchstone in civil rights law, cited in training materials, legal briefs, and academic papers as an example of how personal courage and strategic advocacy can create systemic change. Patricia, Gerald, Raymond, and Brenda all fulfilled the requirements of their settlement, though their paths diverged significantly. Patricia, having lost her career in finance, eventually found work at a nonprofit focused on restorative justice, a position that paid a fraction of her former salary but provided some measure of redemption. Gerald took a job at a small regional airport in Oregon, working in baggage services, a dramatic step down from his position as senior flight attendant, but one he accepted as appropriate consequence. Raymond spent his forced retirement writing a memoir about his experience, with all proceeds directed to civil rights organizations, hoping that his story might prevent others from making his mistakes. Brenda returned to school to become a social worker, determined to spend the second half of her career making amends for the damage done in the first half. For Imani, the incident became a defining moment that shaped but did not define her. With the support of therapists, her parents, and a growing community of allies who had heard her story and reached out with encouragement, she processed the trauma and emerged stronger. Though not unchanged, she won a full scholarship to a prestigious STEM-focused boarding school in Massachusetts, where she excelled in advanced mathematics and aerospace engineering courses. She joined the robotics team, led a student diversity initiative, and was accepted into NASA's prestigious summer program for talented minority students. Her dream of becoming an aerospace engineer remained intact, now fueled not just by intellectual passion but by a determination to prove that Black excellence could thrive in any space, especially spaces where people like Patricia thought she didn't belong. 2 years and 3 months after that fateful flight, Imani Washington stood on a stage at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, wearing a blue jumpsuit emblazoned with the NASA logo and the words "Future Engineer." At 14 years old, She had just completed an intensive 8-week summer program focused on spacecraft propulsion systems, and she had been selected to deliver the closing address on behalf of all 50 participants. Her mother, Simone, sat in the second row, having flown in from Boston where she worked as a corporate attorney, her eyes already glistening with proud tears before Imani even began speaking. Darius occupied a seat on the aisle, his large frame somehow conveying both relaxation and coiled readiness. A father prepared to support his daughter in any way necessary. Behind them sat Clarice Booker, who had stayed in touch with the family and whom Imani now considered an honorary aunt, her face radiating the satisfaction of an educator who had witnessed a student's transformation. The auditorium contained over 300 people: parents, students, NASA staff, invited guests from aerospace companies, and several journalists covering the program's conclusion. Cameras from 2 networks recorded for evening news segments about the importance of diversity in STEM fields. Imani approached the microphone with the same nervousness any teenager would feel before public speaking. But underneath that normal anxiety was a core of confidence forged in fire, a knowledge that she had survived worse than a speech and emerged intact. She took a breath, looked out at the sea of faces, and began. 2 years ago, I was sitting on an airplane, and a woman looked at me with disgust and hatred, not because I had done anything to her, but because I existed in a space she thought belonged only to people who looked like her. She wanted me removed. And the adults in charge, the captain, the flight attendants, the people who were supposed to protect passengers, they chose her comfort over my dignity. They chose to humiliate a child rather than confront an adult's racism. For a long time after that day, I felt broken. I felt like maybe I didn't deserve to take up space, to have dreams, to believe in myself. The room had gone completely silent. The only sound, the soft whir of cameras and the occasional muffled sniffle from someone in the audience. Imani's voice remained steady, drawing strength from the story she had told many times now, but which never lost its emotional power. But my father taught me something crucial. He taught me that my value isn't determined by the hatred of others. It's determined by my character, my choices, and my refusal to accept anyone else's limitations on my potential. He taught me that when people try to push you down, you have 2 choices. You can let them define you, or you can rise up and define yourself. She paused, letting the words settle, then continued with increasing passion. I stand here today as proof that they were wrong. Wrong about me. Wrong about where I belong. Wrong about what Black girls can achieve. I belong in first class. I belong in this NASA program. I belong in engineering labs, and on space missions, and anywhere I choose to be. And so do all of you. She gestured to her fellow students, young people from diverse backgrounds who had earned their places through talent and hard work. We are the future of space exploration. We are the engineers who will design the vessels that carry humanity to Mars and beyond. We are the scientists who will unlock mysteries of the universe. And no one's prejudice can stop us unless we allow it to. The applause started before she finished the sentence, building like a wave crashing against shore. Darius stood first, clapping with enough force that his hands must have stung. His face a study in parental pride so intense it was almost painful to witness. Simone joined him, then Clarice. And soon the entire auditorium was on its feet, the ovation lasting several minutes as Imani stood at the podium, no longer fighting tears but letting them flow freely down her cheeks, tears of release and triumph and hope. This was healing. This was victory. This was a Black girl claiming her power and her future. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed toward a reception featuring NASA-themed cookies and punch, Imani was approached by an elderly white woman with snow-white hair pulled into an elegant bun, wearing a navy pantsuit and a NASA badge identifying her as Dr. Lillian Hartwell, former Director of Human Spaceflight Operations. Imani recognized the name from her studies. Dr. Hartwell was a legend, one of the first women to hold senior leadership at NASA. A physicist whose work on propulsion systems had enabled multiple successful missions. Imani, may I have a word? Dr. Hartwell's voice was cultured, her accent suggesting New England education, her manner warm but formal in the way of people who had spent careers navigating male-dominated institutions. They moved to a quieter corner of the reception hall, and Dr. Hartwell looked at Imani with eyes that had seen much and understood more. I've been following your story. What happened to you on that airplane was unconscionable, a violation of everything we claim to stand for as a society. But what you've done with that experience, the way you've transformed pain into purpose, has been remarkable. I wanted to give you something. She reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew an envelope. This is an invitation to join the Youth Advisory Council for the International Aerospace Association. We're forming a new committee focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the aerospace industry. And we need voices like yours to guide us. We need young people who understand from lived experience what barriers exist and how to dismantle them. Would you be interested? Imani's hand trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope, the weight of the opportunity contained within those few ounces of paper momentarily overwhelming. Yes. Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Hartwell. The older woman smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. No, thank you. You're making us better. You're forcing us to confront our failures and do better. That's incredibly valuable. I look forward to working with you. As Dr. Hartwell walked away, Imani stood holding the envelope, marveling at the strange trajectory that had brought her from the lowest moment of her young life to this pinnacle, from humiliation in the air to standing on the ground where spacecraft were built and launched. Later that evening, in the car ride back to their hotel, Darius asked Imani the question that had been on his mind all day. How do you feel, baby girl? Really feel? Deep down. Imani watched the Houston skyline pass by the window, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the city, and she considered her answer carefully. I feel strong, Daddy. Stronger than I was before all this happened. They tried to break me, but instead, they showed me how much I could endure and still stand up. They showed me what injustice looks like, and now I can recognize it and fight it. I'm not glad it happened, but I'm glad I survived it and learned from it. Does that make sense? Darius reached over and squeezed her hand, his voice thick with emotion. Perfect sense. You know what makes me proudest? Not your grades or your achievements, though those are wonderful. I'm proud that you maintained your humanity through all of this. You could have become bitter, hateful, closed off. Instead, you became more empathetic, more committed to justice, more determined to lift others as you climb. That's who you are, Imani. That's your character, and that's more impressive than any trophy or award. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, father and daughter, connected by blood and by shared struggle and by love that had been tested and proven unbreakable. As they pulled into the hotel parking lot, Imani noticed a plane ascending into the darkening sky, its lights blinking a steady rhythm as it climbed toward cruising altitude. She watched it disappear into the clouds, and for the first time since the incident, seeing an aircraft did not trigger anxiety or remembered trauma. Instead, she felt anticipation. One day, she would design systems for planes like that one, would contribute to the technology that allowed humans to slip the bonds of Earth and touch the stars. One day, she might even pilot a spacecraft herself, become an astronaut, walk on another world. They had tried to ground her, to keep her trapped in their small-minded understanding of who deserved to fly. Instead, they had launched her toward the stars. In the years that followed, Imani Washington's name would become synonymous with advocacy for civil rights and STEM education. She would speak at conferences, testify before Congress about discrimination in transportation, publish articles about the importance of diversity in aerospace, and eventually, at age 24, become the youngest black woman ever accepted into NASA's astronaut training program. But on this night, she was simply a 14-year-old girl who had faced injustice and survived, who had been pushed down and risen up, who had learned that her value was not determined by others' hatred, but by her own strength and character. The final image of our story is Imani looking up at the night sky from her hotel balcony, seeing the stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on velvet, and whispering a promise to herself. They wanted to keep me in my place. Instead, they launched me to the stars. And in that moment, standing under the infinite cosmos, Imani knew with absolute certainty that she would reach those stars, not despite what had happened to her, but in some strange way, because of it. The universe had tested her early and found her resilient. Now, nothing could stop her from becoming exactly who she was meant to be. So what do you think? Should airlines face even stricter penalties for discrimination? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can make travel safer and more dignified for everyone, regardless of race. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss more powerful stories like this, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep the conversation going. To every young person watching this who has ever been made to feel like you don't belong, you do belong. You are worthy. You are powerful beyond measure. Don't let anyone's prejudice become your prison. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice matters, your dignity matters, and together, we can create a world where every child can sit in first class without fear. Until next time, keep fighting for justice, keep believing in yourself, and keep reaching for those stars. This story reveals profound truths about systemic racism and the courage required to confront it. First, discrimination thrives in silence. When passengers, crew members, and authority figures witnessed Imani's mistreatment but said nothing, they became complicit in her victimization. Speaking up against injustice, even when uncomfortable, is a moral imperative. Second, institutional power without accountability enables abuse. Captain Raymond, Gerald, and Brenda all hid behind their positions, prioritizing convenience and prejudice over a child's dignity. True leadership means protecting the vulnerable, not appeasing the powerful. Third, documentation and witnesses are crucial. Clarice's videos provided irrefutable evidence that prevented the airline from burying the incident. In an age of technology, accountability has become more achievable, but only when people choose to record and share truth. Fourth, wealth and success do not insulate black families from racism. Even as the daughter of a billionaire, Imani was subjected to the same dehumanizing assumptions that affect black people across all economic classes, proving that racism targets skin color, not bank accounts. Finally, trauma can become transformation. Imani's pain was real and lasting, but with support, therapy, and love, she channeled it into advocacy and achievement. Victims of discrimination are not defined by what happened to them, but by how they rise afterward, using their voices to create change that protects future generations from similar harm. What would you have done if you witnessed Imani's treatment on that flight? Would you have spoken up, recorded evidence, or stayed silent? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation matters. If you believe every child deserves dignity regardless of their race, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. Share this video with your family, friends, colleagues, and anyone who needs to understand that racism isn't history but an ongoing reality requiring constant vigilance and action. To every person who has experienced discrimination, your story matters, your pain is valid, and your future is not determined by others' hatred. To allies watching, your voice is needed, your action is essential, and your silence is a choice with consequences. Thank you for spending time with Imana's story today. May it inspire you to stand up, speak out, and create spaces where all children can soar without limitations. Until next time, keep fighting for justice, keep believing in human dignity, and keep reaching for those stars. Together, we can build a world where first class truly means first-class treatment for everyone.